Yellow Brick War, Chapter 4. "All right," I snapped, pushing my way back into the tent. Gert looked up, startled. "Let's get this done. The last time I saw my mom, she was a hot mess. Where'd she end up? How did you find her?" "Not the last time, Amy," Gert said gently. "You saw her again. Remember? You saw her in the scrying pool." I knew exactly what Gert was talking about, but I didn't want to acknowledge it. So maybe I had a vision of my mom in a new apartment somewhere, pathetically cuddled up in my favorite sweater, and maybe in the vision she'd been clean. But if that was true, it's just as pathetic. She had to lose me, her house, and her entire life in order to get her act together. If she'd been a real mom, she'd have managed to do it while I was still around. Normal people don't need tragedy to tell them not to blow the rest of their lives chasing their painkillers with booze. "How do I even know that was real?" I asked. "She would be passed out in a ditch somewhere for all I know. Or dead by now." "She isn't dead," Mombi said, looking a little exasperated. "We found her in a broadsheet," she added proudly. "A what?" "A sheet with news and announcements," Gert said slowly, as if talking to an idiot. "In the other place they have pictures." She turned to Glamora. "Can't you believe that? Pictures! I think that's a splendid idea." "You mean a newspaper?" All three witches looked at me, and in spite of myself I stifled a giggle. "Okay, right. So she was in the newspaper." "The broadsheet described the movements of the tornado survivors," Mombi exclaimed importantly. "I used that information and compared it to a map of the surrounding countryside." She brandished a tattered old highway map that looked like she'd found it in a culvert. "You could have just Googled her," I said, laughing. "I don't know that spell," Mombi said gruffly. Mombi had saved the newspaper with the details of the post-tornado emergency cleanup effort. My mom had been moved to temporary emergency housing along with everyone else from the area who lost their homes in a tornado and didn't have anywhere else to go, which, as far as I could tell, was our entire trailer park. "Great," I muttered. "I'll be a Dusty Acres reunion. I can't wait." We talked for a while about what my plan should be, but the truth was that none of us really knew what we were doing. All we had to do was go on a wickedly half-baked theory that Dorothy's maybe mythical magic shoes were somewhere in my old high school, and if they were, I would be able to find them. It didn't even make sense. None of this made sense. Plus, if the shoes had worked to bring Dorothy back from Oz, who knew whether they'd succeed in taking all of us to Oz, even if I could find them? None of us could use our full magic. We were totally making this up as we were going along. But the prospect of action left me weirdly cheerful. Anything was better than sitting around waiting for the end. Even visiting a mom I'd been only happy to leave behind. It was a crazy, stupid, and probably impossible mission. But it wasn't exactly my first crazy, stupid, and probably impossible mission. Once I decided to do it, I almost felt relieved. Nox hadn't come back inside, and I pretended I didn't care. "You might as well get a little rest," Glamora suggested. "It's not even dawn yet. You can get to your mother later in the morning." I wasn't going to argue with that logic. As I settled into a corner of the tent, wrapping myself up in a soft cashmere blanket in the color of Nox's eyes. "Oh, please," I told myself. "Knock it off." I was almost surprised to realize how tired I was. It made sense, of course. I'd been through a lot, and it wasn't like we'd been taking naps in between battles. But I was tired all the way through my bones. I felt like I could sleep for 1,000 years without waking up, and the thought was tempting. I wasn't just physically tired. I was tired of everything. Of fighting, of running, of losing. I wanted someone else to take up the burden of saving Oz for a while. "Get some rest, Amy," I heard Gert say in my head. A warm tingle started in my toes and spread through my body, relaxing my muscles one by one as if they were sinking into a giant bubble bath. It felt like the healing pool in the cave where we'd first been taken to the Order. Before I knew it, I was actually there. The purple walls of the cavern, studded with glittering amethyst stalactites, met in a high arch overhead. The massive tree, whose roots seemed to reach deep into the very heart of the earth, stretched toward the ceiling with gnarled branches covered in tiny white blossoms that drift down around me like a sweetly scented snow. I was floating in the deep, foamy pool, its water as warm as a bath. My clothes dissolved around me as the water drew out my aches and pains and exhaustion. I knew somewhere inside that I couldn't possibly be back in Oz, that the vision was Gert's doing, and I didn't fight it. I drifted off into a deep, dreamless sleep. The witches let me sleep in. The tent was empty, and I could see through its delicate silk walls that the sun was high in the sky. By the time I sat up, yawning and stretching, I didn't feel all the way rested, exactly, but I did feel a lot better. I wondered how long it had been noon for, and then I remembered we weren't in Oz anymore. The sun here moved because the earth was spinning on its axis, not because some crazy power-hungry bitch decided it would be sunny for as long as she'd like it. I wasn't thrilled about being back in Kansas, but that part at least was a nice change. "Oh, good, you're awake," Glamora said, sticking her head through the tent flap. "Mombi ate all the bacon, but I'm sure we can whip you up some more. She says it's important to sample the local delicacies as long as we're here." I laughed out loud at the idea of someone calling bacon a local delicacy, but my stomach growled loudly and even Glamora giggled. I couldn't use magic to fix myself up, so I dragged my fingers through my dirty hair and straightened my clothes as best as I could. Gert's magical cleansing vision had been all in my head. I was pretty distinctly in need of a real bath, but I decided not to worry about that either. If my mom wanted a pretty princess, she could brush my hair herself. I had had about enough of other people's expectations. Knox was wrapping himself up in his quadrant cloak, obviously preparing to go somewhere. He refused to meet my eyes. The distance between us that had sprung up last night felt even stronger now. I wanted to say something to him, reach out, but I didn't know how to cross the gulf I'd now created. I'd been the one to push him away, but I was already regretting it. "Where are you going?" I asked in a low voice, and he practically flinched. "Gert and Glamora wanted me to protect," he began, but Glamora cut him off with a breezy wave of her hand. Gert and Glamora exchanged glances. "We're sending him out to do reconnaissance. Make sure the area is safe." Safe? That was a joke. The scariest thing about Dusty Acres was how empty it was. There was obviously something they weren't telling me. Knox mumbled something incoherent that could have been goodbye, I love you, or go to hell, and I stalked off toward the road into town. I caught Gert studying me with a soulful expression that seemed almost sympathetic. They were trying to keep us apart, I realized. If Knox and I couldn't be together, the witches were going to make sure we weren't around to distract each other. I felt a brief surge of fury. Shouldn't that be up to us? Did I not get to say in my own life? What game were they playing anyway? I'd already decided to keep my distance from Knox, but that was my decision, not theirs. After a breakfast of bacon and eggs, Glamora waved the dishes and picnic blanket away, and I stood up. "I want to get this over with," I said tiredly. "Where's my mom?" Apparently, Gert had been using her extended involuntary Kansas vacation for recon as well as recovery. "I used what we already know from the vision of your mother you saw in your cave," she explained. "Her hut is right near the high school." "At least I won't have to take the bus," I said. "And it's called an apartment." Mombi snorted. "Keep your attitude in check, missy." The apartment where my mom was living wasn't far from Dusty Acres either, and we all agreed it would be better if I just walked there. Glamora was more tired than she should have been from whipping up our tent and breakfast, and Gert and Mombi admitted Kansas was having an effect on their magic too. At least it wasn't just me who was suffering. Although it wasn't much comfort knowing the witches could have a hard time helping me if anything went wrong. Quadrant or no quadrant, I was on my own. It seemed like a bad idea to use their power to transport me to a distance I was perfectly capable of walking. The witches offered to escort me, but I only laughed. "Yeah, right," I said. "No offense, but this is the 21st century. I'm going to have a hard time enough trying to explain how I got here, let alone 3 old bats who look like extras from a senior citizens Dungeons & Dragons role-playing party." Mombi smoothed her blue cloak huffily. "We don't have dragons in Oz," she said. "Never mind," I said, shaking my head. "I'm fine on my own." Gert stepped forward and hugged me, and for a second I let myself get lost in her familiar, comforting embrace. No matter how much the witches had kept from me, and no matter how much I felt like they were using me half the time for some secret, complicated plan of their own, Gert's hugs were still the best. Somehow she always managed to make me feel like everything was going to be okay, even when it pretty clearly wasn't. "We won't be with you here, Amy," she said. "Mombi will take us to the into the Darklands to wait. We'll be safe there, and we can conserve our power." "Great," I said. "So I can't use any magic. I'm completely on my own. I have barely any time to accomplish the basically impossible task you've given me, and on top of that, I have to move back with my mom? Glamora nodded earnestly, her blue eyes wide. Yes, she said. That's really all you have to do. I sighed. Sarcasm was wasted on pretty much everyone in Oz except Lulu and Nox. A little voice piped up in the back of my head. I told it to shut up. We'll be with you in spirit, Gert said, squeezing her hands. And when you need us, when you're ready to use the shoes to open to the portal back in Oz, send us a sign, and we'll rejoin you. What, like a bat signal? I said, rolling my eyes. What do bats have to do with anything? Mombi asked. Never mind, I said. The three of them hugged me in turn, even Mombi, and then joined hands. Mombi closed her eyes and muttered something under her breath. Weakened as she was still far more powerful than I was. I'd never managed to get myself into the Darklands for a brief period until I was fighting Dorothy, and she was taking 2 other people for an indefinite stay without even battling an eyelash. Not that Mombi really had much in the way of eyelashes. Slowly, the witches began to turn gray and then fade, like watching a color movie degrade into black and white. The brightness seeped from their bodies, and their images flattened and grew transparent. Gert opened her eyes and blew me a kiss, and then they faded away together. This was it. Yet again, I was on my own, and the future of everything was in my hands. I sighed and started walking.